Hey all, here at OS Reviews, you're watching our video review of the Samsung Z1. So no, this isn't a new phone. In fact, it was released in 2015, but what makes it interesting is it runs on Tizen OS, which is Samsung's own operating system that's meant to compete with Android, but never really took off. In fact, we now see it on many of their smartwatches and smart TVs, but in terms of smartphones, there haven't been, too much progress. In fact, all the Tizen OS-based phones have been released only in India and in international markets, which is why it's been so difficult for us to get our hands on something like this. Although Samsung originally wanted this to be a direct competitor to the likes of Android, they quickly pivoted and marketed this more as a budget-friendly operating system that you see on low-end devices. Very similar to what we see with Android Go Edition today, as well as with KaiOS, for instance. Many of these platforms that are designed for emerging markets and lower-end handsets. So the Samsung Z1 has specs including a Spectrum 1.2 GHz processor. It has under 1 gig of RAM, in fact, and it has a 4-inch 800 by 480 resolution display, which is an IPS LCD panel. So again, these are decidedly low-end specs. Samsung has historically released one new Tizen phone a year, and what's interesting is the latest one that was released in 2017 still has specs which are very similar to this one. When it first came out, this retailed for around 5,000 rupees, which converts to $80, around 80 euros, and for that price, again, it is an unlocked phone that has dual SIM capability, as you can see by the dual symbol on the top there. On the front, there's also a VGA quality camera for video chatting applications. There's a earpiece. Below the touchscreen, there is a physical home key. There's also a back key and a menu key, which are touch sensitive and capacitive, but unfortunately, they are not backlit, so it's a little harder to see under darker environments. Also, a volume rocker on the bottom. We have access to a micro USB port for charging and the microphone. On the other side, there's access to just a power key. On the top, there's a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, and on the back, you have access to a 3.1 megapixel camera, an LED flash that acts as a torch, and also a loudspeaker. So that 3 megapixel rear camera is the one specification on this phone that really is showing its age. Now the back here is made out of a soft touch rubber material, so it's textured, making the phone slightly easier to grip. The back cover is removable if you wanted to access the 1500 milliamp hour capacity battery along with the SIM card slot and micro SD card slot for expanding the memory, which you'll definitely need because this phone came with only 4 gigs of built-in storage. So before we dive too deep into the software and the performance of this particular phone, just a quick history about Tizen. So again, it is running on a Linux-based mobile OS that is written primarily in HTML5. So you have a mix of regular apps as well as web apps. So for instance, if I tap on YouTube, it's basically taking me into a mobile version of the site by launching into the browser as opposed to an actual app that's installed on the phone. And the same thing can be said about many of the other games and programs on here. They are web apps, which keeps things light and doesn't take up as much memory and feels snappier. You can tell that, again, on relatively low-end hardware, the surprising thing is the phone still runs very, very well. In fact, I'd say it runs smoother than most Android Go Edition phones that I've tried out, including the Alcatel One X, the Nokia One, in addition to the Blackview A20. Something that Tizen was also ahead of compared to Android was the concept of a pull-up system for accessing all of your apps. Since this is running on Tizen OS 2.3, so this is an kind of gesture that all of the Tizen phones had a little bit earlier than on Android OS. So the visual design, for the most part, in terms of the icons and the fonts, aren't too different from a regular Samsung phone running on Android. So you can tap on the settings key here just to add additional pages, and it gives you essentially unlimited pages to populate with additional widgets. And for instance, if I'm on this new page, I can tap on widgets. And just like on Android, you'll be able to find things like music, internet gallery, as well as other alarms. Like on TouchWiz, all of the panels are looping, so it just goes back and forth, and I can also tap on a specific page here just to quickly launch back and forth. The drag-down notification shade also gives me access to things like accessing the LED light as a torch, as well as toggling Wi-Fi, GPS, and Bluetooth on and off. Now, this phone does not have built-in NFC, nor does it have wireless charging. So let's take a quick look at the camera on the Z1 first. There's definitely not a ton of detail, especially as you start zooming into your shots. But one thing that Samsung cameras have always done pretty well in is accuracy in terms of colors. So even though this was captured pretty quickly, you can tell that the kind of wood texture and the color overall looks pretty authentic to what I'm seeing right now in front of my eyes. So overall color reproduction seems alright, but it does again tend to overexpose your skies. So again, not the most powerful camera by any means, but it is functional. Interface also also allows us to do things like add a special effect over the shot. I can also change the exposure level, and I can even, after going back out, press on the home key 2 times to launch back into the camera. So some of these gestures are very similar to what Android offers. So there are a fair amount of customization options for a low-cost device. A test of video playback and web browsing next. It's also a good opportunity to take a closer look at the built-in QWERTY keyboard. So this is what it looks like on Tizen OS. And you can install different languages. There's no swipe built on in, but at least the sensitivity of the display is actually quite good. I've never really had issues though with Samsung phones when it comes to touch responsiveness. It supports multi-touch, it supports up to 5 fingers for input, and you can actually get some pretty good overall typing speed out of this, even though the screen size is on the smaller side. Tizen also offers a cursor that you're able to kind of more precisely move around. There's a magnification glass that pops up. It also allows me to select, copy, and paste. So let's tap on this song here and see how quickly it loads. So pretty much instantaneous, even though the router is actually in a different room right now. So Wi-Fi reception seems to be actually quite good on this handset. Takeaways would be that the experience is actually better than expected. The volume and the speakers do get plenty loud. It's actually decent sounding for being a single mounted one on the very rear. It's a little easy to get muffled up, but you can always pop in your own headphones or use stereo Bluetooth. And also the interface, again, is very responsive considering it's basically just taking you into a mobile page of YouTube. You can tell how quickly kind of the comments, the video is all loading, and scrubbing is almost instantaneous as well. So again, it's quite surprising because if I just loaded up YouTube on the browser for an Android Go edition phone, it would definitely feel more sluggish when it comes to navigation and loading back the video. So taking a quick look at web browsing next, let's just launch into the default browser. And you can also swipe on the side here, so this animation is very consistent throughout the entire OS. What's interesting is by default, the browser tries to load the desktop or classic site first, and because it is very underpowered in terms of the hardware, it does struggle quite a bit. In fact, you have to wait for a pretty long time for the full version of the New York Times to completely load. So that's something to keep in mind. But less complex pages will work without too many issues. Tab browsing, so here's CNET. It is loaded up, again, using the mobile version of the site, and you can see that there's a little bit of choppiness as you're scrolling up and down. You have to wait for a little bit for content to kind of refresh, but afterwards it does work. In order to multitask, you just simply press on the center key here for a few seconds longer, and that brings up this running list that goes in a chronological order to the app that you currently have open to ones which were open previously in the device's kind of history. So you can toggle back and forth between those apps just by long holding, and overall it's still pretty easy to understand. I can also close out of an app by swiping to the edge, and that will exit out of it. So next, let's take a quick look at the Tizen store. This is definitely the weakest aspect of this device, just because Tizen phones are, again, very rare. In fact, there's only 5 models on the market, so there's not a huge selection of apps and developers working on content. You will find a few popular titles, things like WhatsApp is on here, Facebook Messenger. There's also Opera Mini if you want to try a third-party browser, which is also very optimized for low data usage. But if you're looking for the latest games and titles, you'll definitely be disappointed. It reminds me of the early days of Windows Phone and other kind of emerging mobile OSs. Categories, you can search by different genres. I can take a look at top free apps, which again, there's Instagram, there's Temple Run 2, and that's kind of the extent of things. There's Asphalt 8, but there's not even Asphalt 9, just because, again, the Tizen store is not frequently updated compared to Android. So other elements of the device, including the call quality, I was fairly impressed with. The dialer pad here, the interface is quite clean and simple. You can add contacts pretty easily, and because it is a dual SIM phone, you can swap between 2 numbers at once. It's quad band, it's unlocked for global use, so you can simply pop in a SIM card anywhere around the world, and you should be able to make phone calls pretty well. Reception quality is quite strong, just like with the Wi-Fi. Battery life is also very good, just because of the smaller screen, the less powerful hardware, coupled with Tizen, which is a very energy-efficient OS compared to Android. It allows this phone to be used easily for 2 days, maybe even 3 days on a single charge, and it charges up in under 2 hours as well. Taking a look at some of these utility apps and kind of how their UI are designed, we can see that there are differences compared to just TouchWiz on top of Android. This is what the alarm clock app looks like. World clock, stopwatch, timer. So we do have this interesting mosaic pattern that's running across all of the apps here. And I can also tap on MemoPad, for instance, to take a look at what that looks like. So again, it's a little simpler than what we find on a full version of TouchWiz on Android in many cases. Despite being an unlocked phone, there is still plenty of bloatware that you'll find on board. Maybe part of the reason why the price is a little lowered because Samsung probably had some partnerships that paid them to install certain apps on the phone that brought down the cost. So for instance, you'll find things like ESPN. There's also a cricket game on here. There's Facebook pre-installed, Joybox, which is kind of this music app, but it's meant for the Indian market. Probably because of the Linux Foundation's influence, the Maps app is actually using Here, which is kind of the map software originally created and developed by Nokia. So we saw that on all of their Symbian OS phones in the early days. We saw it with kind of OV Maps, as it was called. It's also powered by Here, and it was also found on the Nokia N9. You can pinch in and pinch out of maps pretty easily. It offers offline navigation as well, and it's a nice alternative to, say, Google's Maps or even Bing Maps. So at the end of the day, the Samsung Z1 isn't really a super remarkable phone aside from running on Tizen OS, but for the low price point, it really is again competing with other budget devices, mainly running on Android Go, now here in 2018. And for that, there are still advantages that Tizen offers. For one, I do find the overall UI to be still more optimized, smoother, and faster on really low-end hardware than Android Go Edition, as much as Android is trying and Google is trying. Also, you do get slightly faster loading times with video streaming apps such as YouTube, which are basically web apps written in HTML5. Now, downsides would probably be the fact that Tizen's store is still very limited. So if you have any expectations at all in terms of running more popular titles, probably not going to be there. And although it's possible that Tizen will have the support to install Android-based apps in the future if you want to sideload them, that is still something that you have to troubleshoot yourself. You can check out more details about this in our official review, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Samsung Z1, a Tizen OS-based smartphone from Samsung.